Beirut, Lebanon, Sunday, 23 October 1983, 6:22 a.m. A yellow 19-ton Mercedes-Benz stake bed truck enters the public parking lot of Beirut International Airport, where a dormitory building on the airport grounds is serving as temporary barracks for several hundred members of the 1st Battalion, 8th Marines, who were in the country since August of 1982 as members of an international peacekeeping force whose mission was the enforcement of a ceasefire between Israel and Lebanon, the former having invaded the latter on 6 June of 1982 in response to a spate of rocket attacks targeting Israel originating in southern Lebanon. The truck makes a circle of the parking lot, then suddenly accelerates and plows through 2 concertina wire security barriers. The driver then maneuvers at high speed in between 2 sentry posts, crashes through a chain link fence and a guard shack, embeds the truck into the lobby of the building housing the U.S. Marines, depresses a button on a handheld remote control, thus detonating a compressed butane device which explodes with the equivalent energy of 11 tons of TNT, destroying the 4-story structure and killing himself, 220 Marines, 18 sailors, 3 soldiers, 6 Lebanese civilians, and wounding a further 150 U.S. personnel. Up until that day, 23 October 1983, suicide bombing as a means used by Islamic terrorists to create mass casualty events was something unknown and unprecedented in world history. In the 38 years since that day, as we know all too well, it has become their preferred modus operandi. A group calling itself Hezbollah, which nobody had ever heard of before, claimed responsibility for that attack, thus originating the new depraved art of suicide bombing, which they and many other Islamic terrorist organizations have since used to great effect in every corner of the world in advancing their twin goals of terrorizing populations and inflicting maximal death and carnage and destruction upon the people they deem their enemies, as well as any innocent bystanders who happen to be in the vicinity. The bombing of the barracks in Beirut, in addition to being the first attack of its kind, remains to this day the deadliest suicide attack ever perpetrated on U.S. military personnel overseas, and the second deadliest overall, surpassed in total body count only by the attacks on the Pentagon and the World Trade Center on 11 September 2001. And what's number 2 on that list? It happened yesterday morning, in Kabul, Afghanistan, also on the grounds of an international airport, when 12 Marines and 1 Navy corpsman saw themselves sacrificed on the altar of the crippling ineptitude of the Joe Biden administration. We've heard a lot of talk about how it's the deadliest day for the U.S. military in Afghanistan since a decade ago, but that doesn't do sufficient justice, I don't think, to the enormity of the failure on the part of our civilian and military leadership. Our military leadership, which yesterday, even as our people were being blown to bits in Kabul, was sending out tweets about diversity and inclusion. Our military leadership that cares more about maternity flight suits and correct pronoun usage than it does about formulating an effective exit strategy out of a conflict in which it succeeded in spending $1.2 trillion of your tax dollars, but which created no discernible benefit to you and me, the American citizenry, and whose primary result has been to leave the Taliban in an exponentially stronger position than that which they enjoyed on the day we first arrived in October of 2001. So I think it's much more instructive, much more illustrative of how completely and utterly inept our leaders are, civilian and military alike, for us to emphasize the fact that this incident yesterday was the number 2 deadliest suicide attack on U.S. military personnel overseas since the very first one in Beirut nearly 40 years ago. It goes without saying that the 13 men who were killed yesterday, the 12 Marines and the Navy corpsmen, are heroes who died in service of their country. We've heard a lot of talk about how these are the first combat deaths that we've suffered in Afghanistan since March of last year. But I have a hard time calling these combat deaths. When you die in combat, you're holding a weapon and facing your enemy on the field of battle. You have a fair opportunity to defend yourself. These men did not. They were sitting ducks, soft targets. Instead of holding rifles, they were holding clipboards and water bottles, functioning more as social workers than as combatants, which is how the Democrats prefer it to be. Joe Biden and his administration left their lives and their safety up to the good graces and the security procedures of the goddamn Taliban. We're going single topic tonight because I have a hell of a lot more to say, including about the bumbling, cadaverous oaf who is currently masquerading as our commander-in-chief. So let's pick it up on the flip side. Hit the music, Jim Eagle. From high atop the battlements of Castle Curmudgeon, where the word buffoon is spelled Joebiden. Good evening, Mr. and Mrs. America and all ships at sea. Welcome to the program. I am your eponymous host and humble servant, and I feel like a lot of our fellow Americans, including many of the dumb bastards and bitches who are currently running our central government, they've forgotten, either because they're too young to remember or they're too self-delusional to care, exactly just who the Taliban are and what the Taliban do when they are in charge of a country. I mean, aside from creating a welcoming safe haven for Arab terrorists to launch devastating attacks on the U.S. homeland. The last time the Taliban were running things in Afghanistan, which was only for a 5 or 6 year period between 1996 and 2001, one of the first policies they implemented was the banning of all sports, all music, all dancing, and all the other things that civilized people who aren't 8th century barbarian savages regard as forms of entertainment. Now, do you remember what the only form of government-sanctioned public entertainment was that was permitted in Taliban-era Afghanistan? Well, you could go down to what used to be the soccer stadium, you could buy a ticket, and you and your wife and kids... Wait, that's not right, because this is a gender-segregated stadium, so your wife and your daughters will have to sit in a different part of the venue. But you and your male children, at any rate, could sit and enjoy a fun afternoon of public executions and watch all manner of your fellow citizens being put to death, either for crimes against the Taliban regime or crimes against the religion of Islam, which, according to the strictures preferred by our Taliban friends, our security partners, as General McKenzie, the CENTCOM commander, so lovingly refers to them, means indulging in any modern innovation that has happened in roughly the last 1400 years. If you were one of the lucky ones, suppose you were a woman who left the house without being accompanied by her male guardian, or who had a bit of hair poking through her burqa, or who committed the risible act of exposing too much wrist or ankle while she was out in public. You were one of the lucky ones on public execution day because you were afforded the mercy of a bullet in the back of the head from an AK-47. But if you committed a really serious offense, like speaking to a man who's not your husband, or being alone in a room with a man who's not your husband, or, Allah forbid, actually cheating on your husband, then you got to be the main event on public execution day. Yours was the death that was worth the price of admission for the sellout crowd down at Mullah Omar Stadium. For you would be lovingly buried in the dirt up to shoulder level, and then a group of Taliban thugs would take turns lovingly throwing rocks at your head. Not big rocks, mind you, just little rocks, because we don't want this to be over too quickly, so that the ticket-buying public feels like they've been ripped off. Until you expired from blunt force cranial trauma, and then your dead body was duly dragged off to the thunderous cheers of the assembled crowd. And if anybody thinks the Taliban have moderated since then, that they are some sort of kinder, gentler Taliban now, I got a news flash for you. They haven't. So mark your calendar for the end of next week, because that's when the public soccer stadium executions are going to begin in earnest again. Except it won't be just Afghan women this time around. It is going to be U.S. citizens. The U.S. citizens that President Joe Biden has decided to abandon to their fate because he wanted to have his own mission accomplished party on the 20th anniversary of September 11th. You remember 2 weeks ago when the White House line was, "We will get every single American out and all of our Afghan partners." But then they started shifting the goalposts little by little because, as we have learned all too painfully these past 18 months, these are people who pride themselves on their facility in the art of goalpost shifting. And then it became, "We'll get every American out who wants to get out." And then it became, "We will do our best to get every American out who wants to get out." And by yesterday, the Secretary of State, quivering Tony Blinken, was saying, "You were stupid for going to Afghanistan in the first place, so you're on your own, assholes." And these morons, from the half-dead corpse of Joe Biden right on down, these impossibly stupid, clueless retards, this gaggle of idiots who have all the right fancy degrees from all the right fancy universities, but who between the lot of them couldn't successfully manage a goddamn Dairy Queen for 24 hours, they decided it would be a stupendously good idea to entrust the Taliban, the people who think public executions are the only acceptable form of popular culture, with establishing the outer security cordon at the Kabul airport, thereby placing the lives of our personnel, 13 of whom are now dead, in the hands of people for whom every dead American is a cause for pride and celebration. And it doesn't even matter what the circumstances were whereby this particular suicide bomber managed to get through. Whether it was intentional coordination between ISIS and the Taliban, whether it was sheer incompetence on the part of some Taliban guy, or whether it was as simple as just paying a bribe. It could have been any one of the three. And who cares? Because I guarantee you, it doesn't make one iota of difference to the family of those 12 Marines and that dead Navy corpsman. And it would be bad enough. It would be sufficient cause for mass moral outrage among the American people if that was the only blunder committed by this gang of ignoramuses. Geritol Joe Biden, quivering Tony Blinken, Millie the Wokester, race-hustling Lloyd Austin. But this happened after they all decided it would be a lovely idea if we bugged out of Bagram Air Base, our only fortified, defensible installation in that whole country, in the middle of the night without telling anybody, leaving behind at least $85 billion worth of weapons and vehicles and equipment. 600,000 small arms, 2,500 armored vehicles, 200 aircraft, including 24 Black Hawk helicopters valued at $21 million apiece, 16,000 sets of night vision goggles, untold numbers of drones, innumerable pieces of communications equipment, millions of rounds of ammunition. The Taliban, for the first time in its 25-year history, is now a modern technological fighting force. Why? Because Joe Biden and his administration made the conscious decision to give them that capability, because they could not be bothered formulating an exit strategy that didn't involve pouring gasoline on the whole of Central Asia and then gleefully lighting it on fire. It seems amazing. It seems patently absurd. But Biden and his gang of buffoons still somehow have their defenders, both in Congress and in the fake news media. And I keep hearing from these delusional Kool-Aid drinking apologists things like, oh, it doesn't matter that we gave the Taliban all those aircraft and all those vehicles. They don't have the pilots to fly them. They don't have the mechanics to keep them running. Hey, assholes! You know who's got plenty of pilots and mechanics to spare? Freaking Pakistan! You know, the country right next door, the country whose intelligence service gave birth to the Taliban in the first place, the country that's been the Taliban's primary benefactor and patron and financier throughout its entire existence? How can people say this stuff with a straight face? Is the tribalism of partisan politics really that strong, or do human stupidity and ignorance really have no limits? So then President Corpsey Cadaverton goes on TV to reassure the nation yesterday, and if there's ever been a more embarrassing performance by a chief executive during a time of crisis at any moment of U.S. history, it sure as shit didn't happen during the lifetime of your host. We got a tired, feeble, confused old man, mumbling even more incoherently than usual, speaking barely above a whisper, using his dead son as a human shield yet another time, which is always a very classy move, Joe. His rationale yesterday, near as I could tell, was that because his son Beau was a military veteran and died of cancer after the end of his service, then he, President Joe Biden, knows exactly what it's like to lose a son in combat. Which totally isn't very offensive to the 13 families whose sons died yesterday as a direct consequence of his ineptitude. And there was only one thing the president needed to do yesterday, and he failed to do it. Whether that's a result of an inability or an unwillingness, it doesn't matter a whole hell of a lot. But there was only one appropriate response to these events. And he should have been taking his cues from President John F. Kennedy when he addressed the nation on the Cuban Missile Crisis and stated that any missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere would be considered an attack by the Soviet Union upon the United States. If Joe Biden had any advisors who don't wear their own anal sphincters as fancy necklaces, which at this point I am convinced he does not, if he gave the slightest damn about safeguarding the lives of our remaining personnel on the ground in Afghanistan, here's what he would have said directly to the Taliban yesterday. If any incident like this happens again, if any attacker gets past your security cordon by any means and harms one hair on the head of any American, it will be considered an attack by the Taliban upon the United States, and the entire Taliban leadership will be liquidated with extreme prejudice in under 30 minutes. The planes and the drones are already in the air. We know exactly where you are. You cannot hide. If you're in the presidential palace, we will drop a bunker buster on that son of a bitch. If you take to the road and think you're safe in a moving vehicle, we will stick a Hellfire missile right up that vehicle's goddamn tailpipe. If any harm befalls another American serviceman, the first thing that will happen is you and all of your associates becoming dead. You will receive no forewarning. You will never hear the bomb or the missile coming. Your life will end before you even have a chance to shit your fucking trousers. So think long and hard about your next move. But what did we get from President Joe Biden? We got a feeble old man mumbling some half-hearted crap about, we will hunt you down and make you pay. Which he, of course, read off the teleprompter. He couldn't even look directly at the camera lens for 5 seconds while promising retribution to the murderers of our servicemen. He spent the entire time, as is so often the case, trying to make his escape from the room, because all Joe Biden ever wants out of life is to be able to go to his bedroom, drop his teeth in a glass by the bedside, watch a couple episodes of Matlock while gumming his applesauce, and be asleep by 6:30. And on the matter of Marines, and I say this to commentators all across the political spectrum, please stop calling Marines soldiers. Marines are not soldiers. Soldiers are in the Army. Marines are naval infantry. If you go up to a Marine and call him a soldier, the result is that you're going to have a pissed off Marine on your hands who wonders why you just insulted him like that. On a day when 12 of our Marines just got blown to smithereens without even being afforded a fair chance to face their attacker and defend themselves, the least we can do in honoring their memory is to refer to them with the correct nomenclature, and soldier is not it. Meanwhile, the White House press secretary, our good friend Lady Ginger McFirebush of Alabaster Farms, is still trying to put a happy face on this most disastrous U.S. foreign policy debacle, possibly of all time, by playing up the number of people we have supposedly evacuated, by making comparisons to the Berlin airlift that are in shockingly poor taste, and by assuming the American people are so stupid and have their priorities so out of whack that she thinks she can spin this thing as some sort of sporting event. This is the biggest airlift in American history. It's such a success. As if this is the Airlift Olympics and we should all be totally stoked that the U.S. won the gold medal. Now, it seems pretty self-evident at this point that being congenitally disconnected from reality is the main prerequisite for securing a senior position in the Joe Biden White House. That, and you have to have really nice smelling hair. You know, after having witnessed the first 218 days of the 5-alarm dumpster fire, the big flaming train wreck that is the Joe Biden presidency, I feel like I can say, with complete and total sincerity, that Admiral Hunter Biden, America's greatest naval hero, would probably be a better president than his father is. Because say whatever you want about Hunter, and maybe I'm about to give him more credit than he deserves, but at least that guy, if you provide him with a sufficient supply of hookers and blow, can manage to make it through an 8-hour workday without burning down the entire civilized world. Though, granted, he may burn down a few rental cars, but I think that's a small price to pay, all in all. Also, last thing for tonight, have you been listening to the squad? Demanding that we import 200,000 or 500,000 or 1.2 million random Afghan refugees. It's almost uncanny with these chicks. Any event happens anywhere in the world and they immediately insist that the only proportional response is for the United States to absorb unlimited numbers of foreign nationals and get them suckling from the federal welfare teat for the rest of their natural born lives. And now that I've insulted AOC, She will probably take to Twitter and claim that she was nearly raped by some ruggedly handsome guy on YouTube. But I guess that's life. Here is wishing everyone an agreeable weekend. I won't say delightful and edifying, because I don't think that would be appropriate at this particular moment in our history, but in any event, I will see you Monday. Until then, get off my lawn.